Welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Conrad Weaver. Thank you so much for joining us today. My guest today is Dennis Carradin. He's a counselor, trauma specialist, volunteer firefighter EMT, and the founder of the Trauma Survivors Foundation. Dennis has spent decades walking with first responders through disasters, aftermath, and recovery, and he brings real wisdom about what it takes to heal when you carry more than most. We also talk about how trauma impacts individuals in unique ways and why it's essential to provide training and resilience tools before a crisis occurs and not just in the aftermath. There's a lot to learn today, so let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Dennis Carradin. Well, Dennis, welcome to the First Responder Wellness Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Conrad. Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about you and a little bit of your background and who are you and what do you do?
Well, I like long walks on the beach no, just kidding. Just my formal stuff, I always tell people look, first and foremost, I'm a father of three. So that, how they always said, what do you want on your grave? I always want father first. That's, out of all the other stuff I do, I'm a father of a 27-year-old son, 24-year-old daughter, and a 4-year-old daughter. So it's kind of fun and interesting. I'm a professional counselor. I'm also an expert in traumatic stress. I'm a board certified expert for the American Academies of Traumatic Stress. I run the Trauma Survivors Foundation. I also have I just celebrated, oh my God, it makes me sound so old, but just celebrated my 29th year in practice.
Wow.
I've been a volunteer firefighter and a volunteer EMT. I was that for over 20 years. I'm an author, all around nice guy. How about that?
Okay. So how did you get into trauma therapy? What kind of interested you in that area?
So, it's funny. I think how most firefighters, EMTs start, you start, when you're a junior, and I started when I was around 16. It was firefighting and playing football and all that great stuff. And so when I went to college, it was always in the back of my mind that I really enjoyed, which sounds almost weird, but I enjoyed that world of firefighting. And I had gone to college, never really thinking anything more about it. I ended up doing beach patrol. I was a lifeguard, and stayed marginally into it. But when I was in my master's program at Temple University in Philadelphia, I met my first mentor, and he was a 35-year veteran of the Philadelphia Fire Department, a professional counselor. He was a professor over at LaSalle University, and he looked at me and he goes, "Well, you're going to be my boy now." And I was like, "I don't know what that means. Possibly in jail. I'm not sure." And he took me under his wing and said, "Look, you're going to make you're going to be a part of a movement that is just starting in the world of trauma psychology," which at that time was Jeff Mitchell and George Everly's critical incident stress debriefing. So the Philadelphia Fire Department was the second CISM team, or at the time was the second CISD team ever created, next to Wilmington, Delaware, Wilmington Fire Department, where my hometown is Wilmington, Delaware. And so my mentor, Al, had got me a part of the Philadelphia Fire Department, and then said, "Hey, by the way, you're going to go down and help out the clinical stuff down in Wilmington." And okie dokie. And I went down there. And since that time, it's like your first love. It made a lot of sense to me. I think when people think of trauma psychology, they're not 100% sure. They think of like sexual abuse. They think of a car accident. They don't think in terms of a first responder or healthcare worker. They look at them as superheroes, and they don't.
Sure.
And when the evolution of it, when you talk about how, people get into it, I think when people think of trauma, they're also thinking of a firefighter running into a burning building. They're thinking of a police officer picking up a perimeter or arresting the bad guy. They don't think of what that actually does to the person. So that's where I started was, wow, what does this really do? And as I'm debriefing these folks, wow, it really works. And so then I started honing my craft and, started associating with international trauma firms. I'm on 3 international trauma firms. I started going to major events, spent time at Ground Zero in 9/11, Sandy Hook. I had been flown across the world for most major events, and I just continued to follow that path. So
it's interesting you talk about how the general public really doesn't understand the level of trauma that our first responders experience, and I've seen that in my travels across the country sharing my film, and we occasionally have just everyday citizens coming to our screenings, and they will come up afterwards that I had no idea,
right.
had no idea that this was the depth of stress and trauma these folks carry, and it's like Dr. David Black in my film. He says we outsource our trauma to these first responders.
Absolutely.
And I've often said that first responders carry the weight of the traumas of the world on their shoulders.
Absolutely. I think that is an absolute fair statement. We don't, I think as a society, it's almost like when we suppress something, when a normal person, when something happens to them, they suppress it. They don't want to think about it. They eat too much, they drink too much, and they want to hold it down. A first responder is supposed to not only hold it down, but keep it down. They're not supposed to show it. You got to think about that. You're in the midst of a fire. You're in the midst of getting shot at. You're in the midst of trying to revive a patient, but yet you're told to continue to be professional, mind your environment, and at the same time save this life. I know, oh, by the way, you can't crack, you can't cry, and you got to go on the next run 2 seconds after this run is done.
Right.
So it's wild what society wants those first responders. And outside of the first responder world, look at the healthcare world. Look at the ER nurse. Oh, by the way, you have somebody that's bleeding out and they pass on the table. So now you have to tell the family. And then after that, sorry, you have a 13-hour waiting list or waiting time in the waiting room, and you just have to suck it up and go to the next one. And we don't think about that.
My job is to obviously work with them in that moment, but it's also to kind of say, like, how has this affected you? Like, are you having problems sleeping? Is this just another day? And I also say, it's okay to be okay. It's okay to not be okay. We all have differences in how we deal with stress and deal with this type of situation. But it's wild how that affects people and how what's the whole thought is trauma is unique to the person who's been traumatized.
So how important is it to, obviously it's tremendously important to have support on the backside of these events and these situations. How important is it also to provide training and resources on the front side?
Wow, a great question, because it really is. I think in the past historically, that trauma, the mental health aspect of it was looking as like soft or, it was just optional. We didn't have to talk about it. Just make sure that tactically you followed through, you did what you needed to do, lean on your training and move forward. The issue that we have now is that there's so many people that do that, and then they get caught into burnout or secondary traumatization or post-traumatic stress, and they didn't have the right tools to begin with. And if we were able to give them the tools at the beginning of their career, like when I go into, we'll say Wilmington Police Department, when I go in, they send me in the second week of the academy, and I talk to them about critical incident, and I talk to them about what they're going to see and what they're not going to see. It's kind of like a precursor of the next 25 years. Like, hi, here's this shrink that's coming in to tell you all the bad things about the job and, and so forth. And it's funny when we didn't do that in the past, and now that we've been doing this, in the past, we would see the critical incident and people not really prepared for it. Now we have more people that may be under 10 years on the force that actually seek out therapy. that know that, hey, I don't want to get burnt out. I want to live beyond that 56 years that all first responders apparently have this magical number about. So it's wild.
Do you think that, as we see some of the older generation retiring, that there's going to be more and more movement toward, better mental health focus, kind of agency wise? I'm
Yeah.
agency wide.
I hope to God so. I mean, truthfully, we got to look at it. There's still some boomers that are in office, right? And us Gen Xers, we just put dirt on it and we keep moving on, and we just live with that anger and pain at all times. I think when we start looking at the younger generations, they understand that mental health is important. They understand that their emotional state is just as important as their physical state. So it's not unusual for a 20 or 30 something first responder to seek out therapy, where it is highly unusual for a late 40s, 50s, and 60-year-old first responder to seek out therapy. So my hope is not that the retirees just keep moving on, but the older ones that have been involved in CISM, the older ones that have been involved in psychological first aid, are at least imparting some wisdom into these younger folks, and just saying, like, look, don't follow us, don't do what we did or didn't do. Follow what your culture, what your generation is saying to do. Is that get in there, really address some issues. If something's bothering you, it's bothering you for a reason. And hopefully they'll start getting it. I'm already seeing it. I'm seeing it in all sections right now. I am clearly seeing it, which always surprises me. I'm seeing it within law enforcement, but I think there's a whole other issue there. I mean, law enforcement has been vilified for at least the past 5 or 6 years. So I the pressure that they have is ungodly sometimes.
Yeah. For sure. A while back, I was at an event, and this older gentleman comes up to me afterwards. I think he was a retired firefighter. And he goes, yeah, he said, I've dealt with a lot of things, but at my age, there's just no hope for me. And I was like, dude, your heart's beating,
Yeah.
If your heart's beating, there's hope,
I hope he changes that tune quick. What is it? They run on caffeine, sarcasm, and cynicism, right? It's funny. Some of my older retirees have actually become some of the best peer supporters that I've known. Like they've gone through their careers and they've seen some stuff. And this is, so I'm clinical director for several departments and several teams, but my private team, where we have several retirees, they have become some of the best peer support because they know, A, that the program works, the peer support program works, but B, because they were never told to do the things that they just learned about that they can in part give to other people. So those retirees are wild. And I joke with them because there's a statistic out there that says, especially with policing, is that the average police officer dies by the age of 56. So you get a couple of years of retirement, and that's about it. And that number has not changed for almost 40 years.
Wow.
And the hope is that we're starting to see, hopefully that age go up a little bit. You work so hard for a pension. I'd love for you to get at least 10 years out of a pension.
Sure.
So my hope is that these older retirees that are out kicking that 56-year-old number can come back to give these younger guys and gals, something to look forward to and say there is a life after first responder world.
Yeah. How important is it for those senior members, they're perhaps moved their way up into command staff, and they're looking at the next few years to retire? How important is it for them to set themselves up for retirement in the way of retire to something and not just sit on the couch and watch TV?
I think it's universal right now, and I could be wrong. I mean, but I see the majority And I'll talk about policing because I think that's a little bit different because everybody's a little different in how they do retirement. But within policing, what I see is that they retire from one agency and then they pick up a job in a different agency. So, they might go from, a city officer and then become a hospital constable. I see that. What I do love is that the successful retiree gets out of the field completely. And then they do something alternative, or they might go into teaching. They might, become a world bass fishing pro or something like that, where they leave the aspect behind. But there's some folks that it just doesn't make sense in their world. They have to stay in the first responder world. It's funny. Paramedics, what I see paramedics do is after retirement, they become nurses. So it's that transition to something similar but different. And I don't necessarily know if that's good. It might be good for the individual, but collectively, I don't know if that's good.
It's almost like taking off that uniform is actually taking off who they are. And they have a very difficult time doing that.
And that's, I think, what contributes to the long-term stress and anxiety and depression is that if we can't transition into something that, is healthier than what we are, then, we're always going to carry that burden. And that might be the reason why that number, that 56-year mark, has not changed in 40 years.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's a scary number, and actually something that I'm working on with another film producer. We're actually looking into the idea of addressing the number one killer of first responders, which is heart disease.
Heart disease. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, stress is the prime contributor of it. Yeah. If you look at heart disease and the amount of heart attacks that have occurred in the first responder world versus just general population, it's a number that doesn't even make sense.
Right.
It's pretty wild. You have more people and more first responders that either die from heart disease or suicide than they do in the line of duty. So how does the stress of the job contribute to that?
Contribute
to those numbers or contribute to
contribute to heart disease? Say I'm a police officer. How does my stress, the stressful things that I've experienced, the situations I've been in, how does that contribute to perhaps a problem with heart disease?
Well, but look at the overall, right? So let's look at the lifestyle. Most departments right now are still running like your 10-hour schedule, 12-hour schedule. There's a lot of departments that'll do 5 8s, 2 offs. There's no real set schedule, and then you do two weeks of days, then you switch over to 2 weeks of nights. You have EMTs that are running back-to-back 24-hour shifts. You have paramedics that are doing a 24-hour, firefighters doing a 24-hour shift. And then after they're done with their paid duties, they run over and they do their volunteer duties at the fire station that they might be a chief at or what have you. So if we're just looking at lifestyle and time, that right there is a contributing factor. And last time I checked, we are now abusing more Red Bulls, Monsters, Celsiuses, Code Reds, Mountain Dews than we know what to do with because we're tired. And we think that if we continue to hit ourselves with caffeine and nicotine, that somewhere along the line is going to be the elixir of life, which it isn't. So, okay, now we have the caffeine issue. Are we eating the best of foods if it is 3 o'clock in the morning? Now we're out here in the Delaware Valley and you're running to Wawa to get a hoagie at 3 o'clock in the morning. You're probably not getting the best of nutritions. All right, now let's go into the mental health aspect of it, is that you're being triaged from run to run to run to run. So here's a shooting over here, and the next thing we know, we have a stabbing. Then over here, we have a domestic, and then we have this. And all these departments are running to these different events. You're seeing, especially in the cities, you're seeing fire departments now going on more medical calls than they are on fire calls. Right. All of that contributes to what's happening inside. So now your heart's getting taxed, your blood pressure's through the roof. You're going 0 to 60. every single time you go out to a run. So your heart pumps up faster than it needs to. And then what happens with that lovely little chemical dance in your system? You got the catecholamines hitting your adrenal glands, your adrenaline's pumping, you have dopamine hitting you, all the spiking. And then at the end of the day, go home and be normal. Go home and make sure that the kids have gotten to bed or done their homework. Or, hey, you remember that girl you just started dating that might be a hot mess herself, or that guy that you might think that's cheating on you? Well, you got to address that too. And, oh, by the way, you should probably call your parents because they're worried about you. And then you have to face public scrutiny because the public just loves to mess with you. So if we look at it, I think there's a lot of forces against them that's going to contribute to heart disease. And then ultimately, the second, suicide, is that there's some dark places there.
And then, on top of all that, if you're like a lot of first responders that I've heard about, you're making a little more money. So what do? You go buy the boat, you go buy the toys, but now you got to make an extra payment. So now you're going to work overtime to take care of that, right?
Yep.
And it just compounds.
Well, and you're not going out and doing, bird watching. You are doing the high adrenaline. I just bought that Hayabusa, 1200 cc crotch rocket that, goes down the road at 170 miles an hour. Or I just bought that speedboat, or, you're not doing simple, pleasurable things. You're doing high risk, high adrenaline type of hobbies. Now, again, are there probably the bird watching paramedics or police in the world? Probably. I'm not saying that all of them are doing it, but the vast majority are out there doing the high risk behaviors.
Do you think those high risk behaviors are really a way of silencing the noise?
Absolutely. I mean, you ask any first responder, and I challenge anybody to do this. When you're driving home, how loud is the music? How loud is the music in your vehicle? Because ultimately, you don't want to think about the garbage that you did. You've forgotten to turn on the radio completely, so you're sitting in silence for the drive home, or you're playing the loudest, angriest, craziest music possible, so you don't have to think. You literally, I know for myself, I sit with a lot of first responders and healthcare folks, and I have about a 35-minute commute. And there are nights, when I leave here, that you kind of go into that road blindness, that where the hypnosis, where you start at point A and you end up at point B and you have no idea how you got there. But, Drowning Pool and Ozzy Osbourne has been playing at high volume and I didn't even hear it. So think about somebody that's just gone to 25 different crisis calls in any given time period. They don't want that brain to talk to them. They want to pretty much settle down.
What do you think about someone, let's just say, for example, maybe a police officer retired, it's been a few years, and he or she will say, I spent 25 years, saw a lot of stuff, but really none of it really bothers me.
I'd like them on my couch as well. No. Look, to be honest, one, being always honest, but to be perfectly honest, there are people like that. There are people that said, I spent, 25 years in Philadelphia and saw a lot of crap, but you know what? I don't have problems sleeping at night. I don't have this. I don't have that. I have defied colleagues to test me for PTSD, and I always come out pretty okay. Now, other things I come out a little messed up on, but, PTSD I'm perfectly fine on. But
so what is the difference between that person and the guy next to him who's like, struggling and drinking himself to sleep every night?
Right. Again, this is like that combination of things. I think number one, it's also, you have to have history. I think you could have, twin studies have been done on twin soldiers that have experienced similar action and similar combat, where one goes to war where both of them go to war. One comes back perfectly functional, and the other one comes back completely ridden with PTSD and disabled. Where one, it depends on the history, the nature versus nurture. Did you have trauma in your past? How did you handle the trauma in your past? One, what's the amygdalarian reaction? Do you have a hyperactive amygdala? Do you have a frontal lobe that might be a little bit more sensitive to certain things? How do you deal with grief? How do you deal with certain ideas? There's subscales on certain, like the MMPI-2, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. There's a subscale on there about psychopathic deviancy, which basically says, what's the amount of blood, guts, and gore somebody can withhold or can deal with and hold inside. And sometimes people, before they even get into the first responder world, they have a very high psychopathic deviancy. Now, it sounds bad, but it just basically means what kind of trauma can they see. So I think it's their history, it's their general makeup, it's their genetics. It's things that ultimately that they're almost built for. Like I've always told people is that, especially the first responder world and even healthcare, you were always meant to be what you are, and you might never have known it. You were always meant to be a cop, and then eventually you just put the badge on. You were always meant to be a nurse, and then you put the scrubs on. That somehow your body was set up to do that. And then other people, they could have, they could be in line at Starbucks for 20 minutes, and all of a sudden they're having like Nam flashbacks for some reason. And it's like, no real reason for it, Mm-hmm. And it definitely becomes a challenge, because you could have 10 first responders see the same event, and you have 10 individuals experiencing that in a very different way, mm-hmm. where one's like, cool, let's go eat a sandwich, and another one is in the fetal position crying. So mm-hmm. it's truthfully kind of their background and genetic makeup.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. This can be a little bit personal, but how do people in your industry, the people who care for the caregivers, how do you guys deal with these things? Because you're hearing these stories sometimes, you're dealing with these people who are struggling. How do you take care of yourself? How do you manage those kind of stressors?
Well, I use my friend Jack, Bud. No, just kidding. No. Yeah, no, and it's a great question, and it's something that I believe in. As of late, I started doing. For a therapist that's sitting with this, because you're really sitting with a lot. And for me, mm-hmm. I don't say no. I want to go on those crisis calls. I want to see that first responder, because I know that if I get a phone call and they say, I need to see you, and I say, hey, by the way, I got a 6-month waiting list, is that might be the only chance I get to get them into the office. So I tend to see a lot of therapists, or a lot of first responders. I do see other therapists, but I firmly believe that a good therapist should be in therapy. Mm-hmm. And personally, I think I have the greatest therapist in the world. And it's a funny story, and I'll give personal transparency. So during COVID, I had to have an aortic valve replacement in my heart. So fun stuff, right?
Wow.
And so open heart surgery during a world pandemic, puts on a whole new level. When you're told, hey, by the way, we got tons of people dying, and you have 6 months to live if you don't get the surgery, and then they don't plan the surgery for 5 months. You get a weird perspective on the world
here, right?
Yeah. So when I had that, my surgeon gave me a list of like 12 therapists and said, look, you need to get into it. You see tons of people, you're on these, you go to world disasters, and now, you basically just had a renewal of life. And I looked at him and I said, absolutely. I said, I firmly believe I should probably talk to somebody. I went through that list. I went back to his office and almost punched him in the face for making me go to those 12 people who couldn't understand. Like, I had one guy look at me and start crying when I started telling him some of the disasters that I've been on. And I went, this is crazy. So I literally had gone through that list and didn't find a good fit for me. Now, again, would they have fit for somebody else? Absolutely.
Sure.
For me, not a good fit. So then there was the 13th. And as a good Italian man, 13 is your lucky number. So I met Mayan, who just looked at me and said, okay, when do you want to start to work? And I was like, oh, let's go for it, and I've been with her for several years now, and I've used therapy as not only a tool to kind of help get some of that stuff down, but really to kind of reorganize the thoughts, and I think when you're in the trauma world, and whether it's a first responder, healthcare worker, as a trauma therapist, you do things that are so unimaginable. Like, you do things that just, they don't make sense to the human population. So when you actually verbalize what you do or what you say or what you experienced, it sounds ridiculous. If you say like, wow, I was on the Swiftwater, the rapid Swiftwater team trying to save 12 people that were being swallowed up by a river, and I had to grab them individually as they came down the river. That sounds like a movie. That doesn't sound real. And I think a lot of the first responders start getting the imposter syndrome, where you think, how am I doing this and why? And I have suffered with that for years and years of, I know that I've been to these things. I've known that I've spent months in disaster zones and whatever, but you walk away saying, was that real? So I've used therapy to kind of help me understand that, yeah, it's real. And yeah, I can use that to my advantage to help other people. So me personally, if you're a trauma therapist out there, which there's not many of us, there really isn't. There's not many that specialize with first responders and healthcare worker. You need to get into therapy. You need to at least offload. And even if it's with colleagues or whatever, you need to offload, because I think it opens up the world a little bit. That's me.
I'll never forget when, I'm around this stuff all the time, pretty much every day. I'm talking to someone, about these things. And a while back, my buddy Todd down in Texas, he's actually their wellness officer for Garland PD. He's like, man, when are you going to see a therapist? And he kept poking me about it. He kept poking me. And I said, yeah, that's something I need to do. Right. And then last year, he sends me an email and says, here's a list of all the culturally competent therapists in Maryland. Pick one.
Yeah. Right.
I said,
and?
Yes, sir. And so I did, and I see a therapist. So now I kind of went through that for 6 sessions or so, and I felt I'm in a good place. And so now he's on my speed dial, and if I need to talk to him, I can talk to him. And so it was really good. It was a really good experience. So what would you say to that first responder who's listening to this and is like, man, it's probably something I should do, but I don't know where to start?
Right. Well, and and that I think, just like you and I, it's always to start with a colleague or to start with somebody that you might know that has gone through it. Like, I get most of my referrals are all word of mouth, where I have a cop that tells another cop, a paramedic tells another paramedic, a probation or parole officer tells another probation and parole officer. And I think you start with your colleagues. If you know somebody that's been through something, you might start there. Some people want to say go to the employee assistance program. I think that really depends on the state and the agency. I know, like Philadelphia, and I don't want to call Philadelphia out. I'll just say the Philadelphia area, a lot do not trust the EAP. They feel like the EAP's after their job. Delaware, most agencies do trust the EAP. I think Maryland's kind of mixed depending on where you are. So you want to look at that colleague first. I think the second thing that you could do is go to like your national board, like the National FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police. They have a list of vetted therapists that in your state, and sadly in the state of Delaware, there's only like 2 or 3, but there's a vetted list that you can go to the FOP with. The IAFF, the International Association of Firefighters, they do the same thing. They have a vetted list. And I think so if you can get to those lists, that'll help you a little bit better. If you go to a doctor, because a lot of first responders do not go to a physical doctor, we wait until something falls off, and it's kind of like the old Monty Python skit. Oh, it's just a flesh wound, and they don't have arms or legs anymore, and we might go to the doctor then. Mm-hmm. But go to your physician, because guaranteed your physician has a little bit of an understanding of you if you've been honest with your physician. My heart surgeon didn't have an understanding of me. He's amazing. He saved my life. He's amazing. But I think if you even at that level, go there. The other one is that, go to associated groups. Like if you're, your own FOP group, you go to, the IFF. If you hang out on a coffee club with somebody, you can go to a peer support. Ask your CISM team, ask your crisis response team. If you can go through those avenues, I think you're going to be better than blankly going to Psychology Today and just picking somebody that says they work with first responders. Because right there, you don't necessarily know if they're trauma informed or if they're an actual trauma therapist. Mm-hmm. There is a huge difference.
What is that difference?
Oh, well, so if we look at somebody that has studied trauma, then they have just an understanding that trauma affects the system. Trauma informed means is that something in the past or in the background can ultimately change or alter the way we think or do. A trauma therapist is somebody that is within the midst of trauma care, meaning that they've done the ride-alongs. They have been, shoulder to shoulder with first responders. They have been in the muck and the mire. And those folks are fewer and farther between. I get first responders that'll come into me and said, well, this one said that they were trauma informed. And I said, did you ask them how many first responders they've seen? Well, no, we didn't. I said, well, why don't you go back and ask them how many first responders they've seen and then come to me and we'll talk about it, and not just as a colleague or, not as a patient of mine. And then they'll come back and said they've never seen a first responder. And I said, well, why would you want to remain with them if they have no idea what your culture is? Mm-hmm. They understand that trauma has done something to you, but that could also mean that, they specialize in domestic violence. Well, dealing with shift work and dealing with the amount of emergencies that you see really isn't akin to a domestic violence situation. So it's trying to get first responders to understand that difference. And sometimes you have to talk them through it. Mm-hmm. I think with anybody really, because people really don't understand the difference.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about your foundation and the work you guys are doing. Tell me about that.
So the Trauma Survivors Foundation, my soft plug will be go to the traumasurvivorsfoundation.org and you could see us. I started the foundation after my response to Sandy Hook. I was up a month for the Sandy Hook shooting, and one of my first responses up there was dealing with the families and the first responders, and eventually started working with the different businesses and so forth. And we were stationed in Danbury, Connecticut, and I was headed out to Groton, Connecticut to a company where a lot of the parents had worked, and they wanted me to address the company with mental health. So I was dressed in a suit. I looked very much like, surprisingly, like all the reporters that were up in the area. And I stopped at this Dunkin' at like 6 a.m. And there was a college co-ed behind the counter. And, us Italians, we call it the mezzamort, the kind of the death face. She had the long face, it was sunken in, and I really couldn't figure this out. So when I went to her, I just ordered a large black coffee, and all of a sudden the tears started coming down her face. And the manager come running over, and these are New England people, so I was afraid she might have just like slugged me or knocked me out, but she ran over. And she said, "What did you do?" And I said, "Look, no. I said, I'm not a reporter. I'm actually a trauma therapist. I'm up here for what happened." And she looked at me and she said, one of her nephews was murdered. And my heart dropped. So I said, "Look, do you mind if you and I talk? I can hold off where I need to be." I said, "Let's you and I talk." And I talked to her for about 30, 40 minutes. I found out that she was a college student. She had a high deductible of something like a $15,000 deductible in her insurance plan, and she didn't know where to go. She had been to one of the group briefings that we had, but she just didn't have anywhere to go. So I called a colleague of mine that lived in the area, and I asked him to see her for 10 sessions. I paid for those 10 sessions for her to go see, and that was where the idea of the Trauma Survivors Foundation came up. We decided on a 5-session model where we will pay a trauma survivor or first responder or a healthcare worker to see one of our network therapists for 5 sessions. Now, the highlight to that is now we're 12, 13 years into it. That same college co-ed became a clinical social worker and is doing amazing work. She is working with domestic violence folks. She's working with the grieving and so forth. So it was a great way to start it, but that's how we began. And then, we started shifting a little bit. We started teaching. We developed our CIRS program, our Critical Incident Response Strategy program, where it's a little bit more streamlined than CISM, but we use it within our peer support model. We also ran out during COVID. We did the Hospital Heroes Food Drive and had delivered over 200,000 meals to about 150 locations that were fire, police, hospitals, and so forth. So we've been active. We're there. We always tell people, check us out, and if there's a good fit in our network for you, if you are a therapist, please fill out our application. And if you're a first responder that wants the training to be a crisis responder, please fill out the application, and we'll get you hooked up.
So what's next for you? What are you working on? What are you excited about?
I'm going to try to tell my 4-year-old that we can't go to Five Below tonight. That's what. That's an every night thing. So no, there's a couple of things. I'm published. I have 4 books out there, and I'm finishing up my own book. It's called On Being a Trauma Therapist. So I have a book title that's going to be coming out here soon. That one was, the other ones were about resiliency, about how first responders. My one book that came out last year, Beyond the Call, came out, which was about how to access the mental health and how to build up resiliency. But I did, this book On Being a Trauma Therapist is just about, truthfully, kind of my work and what I do, and how it affects you and how it affects the people around you, and what you see and what you don't see and what the public perception's about. We have a lot of events that come up. We're a very active foundation, so we get involved in a lot of events. We have some fun stuff coming up. We just signed our contract. We're doing a 5K in Delaware in August. We have the Chesapeake City, which, in Maryland, we have the Chesapeake City Seafood Festival we're a part of. We have the Philadelphia Coffee Festival. So we do a lot of fundraising events for that. But for me personally, it's the book and chasing around a 4-year-old. So, those are my loves. That's what I do.
Awesome. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom. Absolutely. And for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Great. Thank you so much.
Dennis, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your heart and experience. I really do appreciate the work you're doing. And to you listening, if anything in this episode hit home, don't ignore it. Take that next step. Call a buddy, reach out to someone you trust. You don't have to carry it alone. And hey, if you know someone who needs to hear this conversation, maybe they've been struggling quietly, please send this episode their way. And finally, please remember that you are not alone. And if you need someone to talk to and don't know where you can turn, you can always dial 988 for help. Until next time, be well, take care of yourself and those around you, and go out and do something great in the world.